Before we get started, let's create a rectangle in the 2D window and simulate it. Let's also position it something like that. And also insert some pins, so we'll get some points that are elevated from the ground, so we'll be able to observe the effects we'll be putting on. And let's also reduce the particle distance from 20 to 10. So we'll have more information going on. Alright, and now if we click on the default fabric that is currently applied to the rectangle, let's scroll down to the physical properties again. Now you might have noticed that whenever I choose a material preset, I can also see the properties under detail. So you can either choose a material from the tab and edit it a bit more, or completely make up your own settings right here. So let's take a look at what each setting does. Now first we have the stretch, weft, and warp, which we are already somewhat familiar with from the shrinkage, weft, and warp. So the first one gives us stretchiness in the horizontal axis, and the second one on the vertical axis. Now if we lower both of these, I'm just going to lower it. And I'm under simulation mode, so I can see what happens to the garment. Now you will see that I get some sort of droopiness effect, and if I try to also move the points in the 3D window, you'll see that it's much more harder to move them around. So it's like the garment became heavier. And if I go the other way around, you see immediately the garment bumps up back again. The third option is called shear. Now, shear starts pulling the fabric in the cross section. So weft is horizontal, warp is vertical, and shear is diagonal. Now, lowering the shear will produce material that has good elasticity. But since these three values are very similar and work together, it's a good idea to keep them close. So if everything is bumped up, we should bump up the shear as well. Or the other way around, of course. So let's go back to the default, which was 27. And shear, I think it was 8 or 9. So let's leave it at that. Next we have the bending, weft, and warp. The higher we put these values, the less the fabric is going to bend. So if I put this way higher, both the warp and weft, you can see that I'm actually losing a lot of details. A lot of wrinkles are going away because the fabric simply isn't bending enough. So it became very stiff. And if I try to lower these settings, you will see that the fabric drops again. Next we have the buckling ratio weft and buckling ratio warp. So the buckling ratio controls if the material can be easily bent or not. The higher it is, less force is needed for it to bend. This is a setting that can be a bit more difficult to observe, since it won't necessarily be visible if we have an outfit that simply hangs on our avatar, but it can be useful if we're creating folded towels, sheets, or any kind of fabric that is folded. So with this setting, we can create a visual difference if we are folding, for instance, a silk-like material that's easily folded, or a material like wool that isn't. Next, we have the buckling stiffness weft and the buckling stiffness warp. Now these values go together with bending weft and warp. The higher the value, the more stiff the fabric falls on the corners, and the lower, the easier it falls. Now I doubt that we're going to be able to see that, since I don't really have any corners. So this is meant for if you have a tablecloth or maybe a blanket that goes over a bed, and you would like to define how the corners fall for that particular garment. Next we have the internal damping. Now this is mostly used in animation. If we increase it, the garment moves slower as if it were underwater. So if I try to move it, as you can see, it gets more and more difficult to move. And now it's much easier. And as I said, this is also something that's going to be difficult to observe when the garment is not animated. but it comes very useful when we add sort of motion to the garment. Density. Now density affects the heaviness of the garment. And next we have the friction coefficient, which basically enlarges the friction between the garment and, let's say, the ground, or maybe the avatar, so the garment and the avatar's skin. So if we're doing tank tops or straps around the shoulders and we would really like to position them in place, it's a good idea to bump up the friction so the strip of fabric won't necessarily slide down from our avatar's shoulders. And next we have the thickness setting. So we are also able to apply thickness within MD. And let's try with 3 millimeters. And if I just zoom in into the 3D window, and let's go here to the textured surfaces setting and switch to thick texture surfaces. And now we can see this is actually the thickness that we applied. So this is also very useful for towels or any kind of material we would like to emphasize that is thicker than the other. Alright, so as you can see, we can really define our fabric with the help of these settings. And if we're happy with these settings, we can also save them right here, clicking on this icon, and keep that material for later use. Now in the next clip, we will be putting some fabrics on our outfit and preparing our final version of the mesh.